For more than 250 years, the world has watched the same nightmare replay itself in different costumes. In 1789, France was the cultural superpower of Europe. In 1917, Russia ruled 1/6 of the planet. In 1959, Cuba was one of the most prosperous countries in Latin America. On the surface, these countries looked strong, modern, and untouchable. Yet in just a few short years, each of them collapsed into revolution, terror, and dictatorship. Most people think revolutions begin with angry crowds in the streets. They imagine barricades, flags, and soldiers firing into the air. But that is never where the real story starts. Revolutions begin in the balance sheet of a nation. They begin in tax ledgers that no longer add up in debt, that can never be repaid in households where the cost of food, housing, and survival climbs faster than income. Long before the first stone is thrown, the math has already turned against the system. When you line up France, Russia, and Cuba side by side, a pattern appears. 6 stages. 6 repeating steps that turn a rich, confident society into a broken one. The details change. The ideology changes. The slogans change, but the underlying financial physics do not. And when we compare that same pattern to the United States and other modern countries today, the most disturbing question is simple. How many stages have we already passed without realizing it? Revolutions do not begin with fire, they begin with pressure. Slow, silent, invisible pressure building inside a society until the entire structure can no longer hold its own weight. This pressure begins in stage 1 and stage 2. And in every major revolution of the past 250 years, these 2 stages look almost identical. To understand why nations collapse, we must start with a simple truth. Societies do not fall because people are poor. Poverty has existed forever. Societies fall when the gap between expectation and reality becomes too wide for the middle of the population to tolerate. They fall when the rules feel unfair, when the system feels rigged, and when the government begins to serve a minority instead of the majority. This is where the cycle always begins. In late 18th century France, the kingdom appeared strong from a distance. Paris was the center of art, literature, and diplomacy. French thinkers shaped modern philosophy. But underneath this cultural brilliance was a financial system collapsing under its own contradictions. Less than 2% of the population, nobles and clergy, paid almost no taxes. Meanwhile, everyone else paid nearly all of them. The peasants worked the land, the merchants kept the economy moving, and the middle class produced the ideas that lifted the country forward. Yet this entire economic engine existed only to support a tiny, insulated elite. When the harvest failed in 1788, bread prices doubled. Bread was not a luxury. It was almost the entire diet of a peasant family. With prices rising and wages stagnant, millions faced starvation. But inside Versailles, life continued, as if nothing had changed. Feasts, balls, perfume, silk. This is not just inequality. It is a system where the people who suffer the chaos are completely separated from the people who create the rules. And once that separation becomes visible, the clock starts ticking. Russia entered the same stage more than a century later. In 1917, the Russian Empire looked enormous and powerful. But like France, its strength was an illusion. Most citizens were peasants who had been freed from serfdom in name only. They worked land they did not own. They earned wages that could not sustain a family. The nobility lived in palaces. The Tsar ruled with absolute authority. And the government's bureaucracy was too corrupt and too incompetent to modernize the economy. Then came World War I. Russia mobilized millions of soldiers but could not supply them. Some units had no boots, others had no rifles. Many had no ammunition. The war did not just bring death, it brought humiliation. A government that cannot protect its soldiers cannot keep its citizens' trust. By 1917, the country was bankrupt, the currency was collapsing, and the people had lost patience. The conditions for revolution were locked into place long before the first protest broke out. Cuba in the 1950 seconds may look very different, but the underlying mechanics were the same. Havana was wealthy, glamorous, and modern. American investors poured money into casinos, hotels, and beachfront properties. But prosperity stayed in the capital and in the hands of Batista's allies. Rural Cuba remained stuck in deep poverty. Education, healthcare, and basic infrastructure were almost non-existent outside urban areas. The government functioned not as a public institution but as a machine for corruption. Bribes replaced justice. Political loyalty replaced competence. For ordinary Cubans, there was no path to a better life. The system served those in power and ignored everyone else. France, Russia, Cuba. Three completely different societies. Three completely different eras. Yet their early-stage collapse looks almost identical. A wealthy elite insulated from reality. A government that cannot or will not reform. A growing sense that fairness has disappeared from the system. And a population that begins to feel the country belongs to someone else. This is Stage 1 and Stage 2. Extreme inequality. Government corruption. Institutional incompetence. These conditions alone do not cause a revolution, but they create the soil in which revolution takes root. Once a nation reaches this point, the pressure continues to build slowly, steadily, relentlessly. And if we look at modern nations today, including the United States, we see echoes of these same early signals. Wealth is concentrated in a narrow elite. The cost of living rises faster than income. Trust in government institutions falls year after year. Political division grows. People work harder, but feel less secure. It is the same quiet pressure that preceded the great revolutions of the past. Stage 1 and Stage 2 are never dramatic. They do not capture headlines. They rarely inspire panic. But they set the direction of the story long before the crisis becomes visible. Once these cracks appear in a nation's foundation, history shows that the structure above them will eventually begin to shake. If the first two stages create the hidden fractures inside a nation, then Stage 3 and Stage 4 are where those fractures widen into a break. These stages are the most misunderstood, yet the most decisive. Revolutions do not ignite because the poorest rise up. They ignite when the people who once believed in the system, teachers, lawyers, soldiers, clerks, small business owners, educated youth, reach a breaking point. When the middle class loses economic stability and then loses faith in the institutions meant to protect them, the system enters a dangerous zone from which almost no nation returns. This is the story of France in 1789. The peasants suffered, yes, but the revolution did not begin with them. It began with the educated members of the Third Estate, merchants, lawyers, writers, intellectuals who felt locked out of political power. They were not the poorest. They were the backbone of the economy and the carriers of new Enlightenment ideas. When King Louis XVI refused to give them fair representation, they realized the system no longer respected them. Their response was bold and irreversible. They declared themselves the National Assembly and vowed not to disband until France had a constitution. In that moment, the monarchy's authority shattered. A government that loses the allegiance of its middle class loses its legitimacy. Russia reached the same critical moment in early 1917. Food shortages led to protests, but protests alone do not topple empires. The turning point came when the soldiers, the young men drawn from the middle and lower classes, refused to fire on civilians. The Tsar still sat on the throne, but his power evaporated in an instant. Without the loyalty of the army, the monarchy was a symbol, not an authority. Within days, Nicholas II abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not with a dramatic war, but with a decision by ordinary soldiers to stop defending a system they no longer believed in. Cuba in the 1950 seconds followed a similar pattern. The rural poor were frustrated, but the decisive shift occurred when students, journalists, teachers, and young professionals turned against Batista's regime. This was the group that should have been building Cuba's future, yet they faced a government that silenced dissent, manipulated elections, and enriched its friends while ignoring everyone else. When the educated youth abandoned the system, they gave the revolution moral legitimacy. Batista could no longer claim to represent the nation when its next generation rejected him. These three cases show the same political physics at work. Stage 3 begins when the middle class feels squeezed between rising costs and shrinking opportunities. Their frustration is economic at first. But Stage 4 begins when they stop believing the system can fix itself. Once trust in institutions collapses, Trust in courts, trust in elections, trust in the media, trust in the leadership. Every political argument turns into a moral one. Compromise becomes betrayal. Opponents become enemies. The public stops arguing about what policies should be adopted and begins arguing about whether the government itself is legitimate. This phase is slow, then sudden. For years, people debate. They complain. They criticize. But somewhere along the line, the debate shifts. The public begins using language that signals they no longer see peaceful reform as possible. The system is rigged. Nothing will ever change. The elites don't care. We need something new. These are not just angry words. They are early signs that a population is psychologically preparing for more drastic solutions. France gave us the tennis court oath. Russia gave us soldiers refusing orders. Cuba gave us student movements organizing resistance. Each moment represents the same psychological shift, the realization that the institutions at the center of the nation no longer command respect. And now when we examine the United States and other modern nations, we see unsettling parallels. The middle class faces rising housing prices, medical bills, and education costs. Young people carry heavy student debt and often cannot afford homes. A majority of citizens believe the political system is corrupt or ineffective. Confidence in Congress, the courts, and the media has fallen to historic lows. These are the exact indicators historians identify as Stage 3 and Stage 4. Stage 1 and Stage 2 describe a nation under pressure. Stage 3 and Stage 4 describe a nation losing its balance. Once a society enters these stages, the ground shifts beneath it. The institutions still stand, but they no longer command loyalty. They still exist on paper, but not in the hearts of the people. This is the moment when the forces of stability weaken and the forces of disruption begin to grow. And in every revolution of the past, once Stage 4 is reached, Stage 5 follows much faster than anyone expects. When a nation enters Stage 5, the fight is no longer about policy. It is no longer about reform. It becomes a struggle between survival and collapse, between groups who believe the only path forward is to tear down the system and rebuild it in their own image. Stage 5 is the moment when moderation dies. It is when the political center empties out, leaving only two increasingly angry poles pulling a country apart. France offers the first and clearest example. Once the National Assembly proved the monarchy had lost its legitimacy, a vacuum formed. And history teaches us that vacuums do not remain empty. They attract the most organized, most ruthless groups. The Jacobins understood that revolutions reward those who control fear, not those who preach unity. They promised justice. They promised purity. They promised protection from enemies, both foreign and domestic. And in a moment of desperation, the public followed them. What began as a movement for rights and representation transformed into the Reign of Terror, where tens of thousands were executed in the name of preserving the revolution. Russia followed the same path with chilling precision. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar hoped to stabilize the country. But once the public lost confidence in its ability to deliver peace, food, and stability, the center collapsed. Lenin and the Bolsheviks filled the vacuum. Their message was short and powerful. Peace, land, bread. They offered simplicity in a chaotic world. They promised order. Like the Jacobins, they gained power not because the public fully understood their agenda, but because the public rejected everything else. And when they seized power in October 1917, they moved quickly to eliminate rivals, silence critics, and reshape the nation. Civil war followed. Millions died. The country exchanged imperial oppression for revolutionary oppression. Cuba in 1959 reveals the same pattern in a modern context. When Batista fled the country, Cuba did not become democratic. It became directionless. Power concentrated in the hands of Fidel Castro and his closest allies. At first, Castro spoke the language of freedom. He promised elections and justice. But as soon as he secured control, he began eliminating opponents, restricting the press, and nationalizing the economy. Those who had fought with him soon discovered the revolution did not belong to them. It belonged to the new ruling class. The cycle repeated once again. A corrupt dictatorship fell only to be replaced by a more centralized and more enduring one. All three revolutions expose the same political law: extremism thrives when the center collapses. This collapse does not happen overnight. It begins subtly with frustration and protest, but accelerates rapidly once stage 4 ends. By stage 5, a society enters a moment of emotional vulnerability. People are tired. People are angry. People are afraid. And in that emotional state, they turn to the groups who speak the loudest, promise the most, and act the fastest. And that is what leads to stage 6. Stage 6 is not just the fall of a government. It is the collapse of an entire social order. It is what happens when institutions lose authority, when political opponents become enemies, and when violence becomes normalized. In France, it created chaos and paved the way for Napoleon's dictatorship. In Russia, it led to decades of authoritarian rule and widespread suffering under Stalin. In Cuba, it created a one-party state that lasted 6 decades. Stage 6 teaches us a harsh truth. Revolutions rarely bring freedom. They bring new rulers. They bring new forms of control. They bring new extremes. The promises of equality, justice, and liberation dissolve once power centralizes in the hands of those most willing to use force to keep it. And today, when we look at countries around the world, including the United States, we see early signs of stage 5 forming on both ends of the political spectrum. On the left calls for radical redistribution. On the right calls for stronger executive power and the weakening of institutional checks. Both sides see the system as broken. Both sides believe the other is a threat. This is how stage 5 begins. Not with a violent uprising, but with millions of people losing faith in peaceful solutions. Stage 6 comes after. And once a nation reaches that point, the consequences are not theoretical. They are historical, they are predictable, and they are devastating. When we step back and examine France, Russia, and Cuba across their different centuries, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. These revolutions were not accidents. They were not spontaneous explosions of anger. They were the end result of a pressure cycle that had been building for years, sometimes decades. And once that cycle reached its final stages, the collapse of the old world became unavoidable. The 6-stage model is powerful because it strips away ideology and emotion. It shows us the structural mechanics beneath every revolution. It shows us the economic pressure, the political decay, the psychological unraveling, and the rise of extremists who thrive in chaos. Once these forces align, a nation cannot simply vote its way out of the crisis. The system has already lost its legitimacy. The center has already caved in. And history tells us that when moderation dies, the extremes fill the void. France proved this with brutal clarity. What began as a movement for equality ended in mass executions. Russia followed the same path, replacing a failing monarchy with a rigid authoritarian regime. Cuba repeated the cycle in the modern era, turning a promise of liberation into a one-party state. In each case, the revolutionaries claimed the moral high ground. But once they seized power, they built systems even more controlling than the ones they destroyed. This is the hidden warning inside the 6-stage pattern. Revolutions rarely produce the future they promise, because they do not begin in stability. They begin in collapse. They begin when institutions are weak, when trust has evaporated, and when society has already fractured into competing camps. A revolution cannot build what does not exist. And when the old order breaks, the strongest and most radical actors seize control of whatever remains. And now, as we look at the world today, the pattern feels uncomfortably familiar. Wealth inequality is rising. Trust in government is falling. Political polarization is widening. The middle class struggles with costs that outpace income. Institutions that once felt solid now feel fragile. These conditions are not random. They are the early stages of the same cycle that pulled previous nations into collapse. The question we face is the same question every society before us has faced, whether they realized it or not. Can the cycle be interrupted? Can a nation restore trust before the middle class collapses? Can institutions reform themselves before the public abandons them? Can the extremes be contained before they become the only voices left? History suggests the odds are not favorable. Most nations do not recognize the danger until they are deep inside stage 5 or already sliding into stage 6. By then, the pattern tightens like a vice. Every attempted solution fuels more anger. Every political action becomes a spark. And every year of stagnation pushes the nation closer to the point of no return. But the fact that the cycle is predictable also means something important. It means the warning signs are visible long before the breaking point. It means that collapse is never sudden. It is slow, then fast, quiet, then explosive. It grows out of choices, out of policies, out of economic pressures and political failures that accumulate over time. If we want to understand the future, we do not need to search forward. We need to look backward. The answers are not hidden in tomorrow. They are written line by line in the stories of the nations that thought they were too strong to fall. France believed it. Russia believed it. Cuba believed it. And each of them followed the same 6 steps into chaos. The pattern never lies. The only question is whether we choose to see it.